She was a 19-year-old virgin girl who cleaned the house of a cold and dangerous millionaire. He didn't believe in love, only in corrupting the purity of those who had never been touched. If you love love stories and romance, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. Stay tuned. Since she was 17, Annalise had grown accustomed to the smell of cleaning products that clung to her skin, even after showering, to the cold that burned her knees on the ceramic floors of the wealthy homes in Highland Park, and to the inner silence that grew every time her mother coughed blood at home, without money for new medical tests. Tuberculosis was advancing through the lungs of the woman who had raised 3 children alone, sewing school uniforms until late hours to pay the rent for a back room in a house in West Side. At 19, too thin for her height of 5 feet and 5 inches, with dark circles shadowing her brown eyes, Annalise was called by a luxury cleaning agency to cover for an employee who had fallen ill. The payment was 3 times the normal rate, $1,500 a week to clean a mansion in the most affluent region of Chicago. She didn't question the value or urgency. She needed the money like air to breathe. She arrived at the Lawson mansion on an overcast day in March, the sky heavy with grey clouds reflecting her exhausted soul. The electronic gate opened automatically, as if someone was watching her. The house was imposing, with geometrically perfect gardens and architecture that mixed modern lines with classic details, white marble, mirrored glass, and a central fountain that cascaded crystalline water. It was a completely different world from her own, where even the air seemed cleaner and more expensive. She didn't know that, at that very moment, Alexander, Lawson the owner, was observing her through security cameras while attending a video conference with international investors for his hotel chain. He saw her for the first time with the clinical coldness of someone evaluating a rare collectible. Worn jeans clinging to thin thighs, a loose white t-shirt hiding small breasts, brown hair tied in a messy bun, and that calm, almost resigned expression that seemed to beg not to be noticed. Alexander was 37 years old and the sole heir to a fortune built over 3 generations. His company controlled luxury hotels in 15 countries, but his wealth came with a loneliness that corroded him from within. He had possessed many women over the years, almost all through discreet contracts with high-end escort agencies. Beautiful, sophisticated women, trained to obey without ever questioning his darkest desires. But none had awakened in him more than a passing interest, a physical need quickly satisfied and forgotten. His childhood had been an emotional captivity that forever marked his way of relating to the world. Helena, his mother, was an internationally recognized artist, a woman of ethereal beauty who painted abstract canvases full of vibrant colors. His father, Charles Lawson, was a successful businessman who hid destructive alcoholism and a violent temperament that only the family knew. On a freezing winter dawn, when Alexander was only 6 years old, he woke to screams coming from his mother's studio. He descended the marble stairs of the mansion where he had grown up and found a scene that was branded in his memory like a hot iron. Helena was lying on the floor, blood splattering on the white canvas she had been painting, while Charles held a bloody knife, his eyes glazed with alcohol and hatred. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, too small to understand, too grown to forget. That vivid red became the color of his adult fantasies, mixing pleasure and horror in every touch, in every relationship he built, based on absolute control over others. After his mother's death and his father's imprisonment, he was raised by a succession of nannies and then in cold, silent boarding schools in New England, where he learned that to avoid being hurt, it was necessary to hurt first. Where he discovered that power was the only form of love he could understand. On the second day that Annalise cleaned his house, he cancelled all meetings just to watch her work. She scrubbed the white marble floor of the main room with a force that made her small hands red and injured. The cold water soaked her t-shirt, discreetly revealing the contours of her small breasts. She didn't notice his presence on the stairs, and that fascinated him more than any seductive look received in sophisticated bars or presidential suites around the world. He began to observe her compulsively through security cameras scattered throughout the house, enlarging the videos on his phone during important meetings, Pausing at each moment, she sighed and rested her forehead against the tiled wall to rest, in a childish gesture of exhaustion that left him hypnotized. There was something about her that awakened not just desire, but a different hunger, deeper, that he couldn't name. That night, it was raining heavily. The March storm lashed the windows of the mansion with a force that made the glass tremble. Alexander was in his office on the second floor, reviewing acquisition contracts for a new hotel in Key West, when he decided to check the security cameras. It was almost 2 in the morning, and he expected to find the house empty and silent. But on the kitchen monitor, he saw an image that paralyzed him. Annalise had fallen asleep, kneeling, on the floor, completely overcome by fatigue, her face resting against the refrigerator door, her loose hair covering part of her face like a protective veil. She had been there for hours, probably cleaning until she could no longer stand. Her parted lips let out a soft breath, and even while sleeping, her eyebrows remained furrowed as if she carried worries even in her dreams. Alexander descended silently from his office, his bare feet making no sound on the cold marble. He approached her slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal, and stood there for long minutes, watching her sleep. He took a grey wool blanket from the living room sofa and covered her thin shoulders with extreme care, trying not to wake her. When the soft fabric touched her skin, she sighed softly, a sound that pierced his chest like a blade. He stayed there, crouched beside her, feeling for the first time in years something he couldn't name. Compassion or possession, protection or domination, or perhaps all these mixed into an emotion that frightened him with its intensity. When she woke, it was already morning and the blanket was still over her shoulders. Annalise looked around confused, trying to understand how she had ended up there, how that expensive and soft blanket had reached her. She felt watched, but couldn't identify where this feeling came from. Putting away the blanket and continuing to work was her only option. She couldn't afford the luxury of asking questions or arousing suspicions. Alexander's obsession grew like a poisonous plant. He began leaving small gestures she couldn't explain. Hot coffee already prepared when she arrived on colder days, made exactly as she liked it, with a spoonful of sugar and condensed milk. The replacement of harsh industrial soap with French, lavender that left her hands perfumed. The radio tuned to soft classical music when she cleaned the porch windows, always melancholy pieces that matched the rainy March weather. Annalise tried to rationalize these small miracles. Perhaps it was kindness from the housekeeper who came only twice a week, or perhaps Alexander himself, whom she rarely saw, but whose presence she felt like a weight in the air. But deep down, a part of her knew she was being watched, studied, and this left her afraid and at the same time strangely excited. It was the first time in her life that someone had paid attention to her details, to her preferences, even if in a silent and mysterious way. Alexander wasn't a man seeking love. At 37, he had given up on that possibility. He was a man seeking experiences that would make him feel anything alive beyond the ice that had formed in his chest since his mother's death. Each woman who had passed through his life had been an experiment, an attempt to awaken something that remained dormant. But with Annalise it was different. She awakened in him not just desire, but a need to possess, to protect, to corrupt and save at the same time. When he discovered, through an identity document forgotten in the kitchen, that she was only 19 years old and that her address was in one of the poorest regions of Chicago's West Side, something inside him ignited. He hired a private investigator to learn more about her life. He discovered that she was a virgin, that she had never dated, that she supported her sick mother and 2 younger siblings with the money she earned cleaning houses. He also discovered that she had grown up in an orphanage until the age of 10 after her father's violent death, and that since then she had carried an ancestral fear of authoritarian men. This information didn't awaken compassion in him. It awakened an even greater hunger, not just for carnal desire, but for the possibility of being the first to touch that purity, the first to teach that virgin body the secrets of pleasure and pain. He wanted to be the only one to see her reactions, to map each moan, each sigh, each tear of pleasure or fear. He wanted to possess not just her body, but her soul, her thoughts, her dreams. Annalise felt that something was changing. The sensation of being watched haunted her through the silent corridors of the mansion. When she cleaned the mirrors, sometimes, she had the impression that there was someone behind her, watching her reflection. When she climbed the stairs, she felt heat on her back as if burning eyes followed her. At night, lying on the thin mattress in her room in West Side, she cried silently, not just from the unknown fear growing within her, but from the guilt of feeling, in that invisible man's gestures, a sick tenderness that made her feel finally important to someone. Fate held other secrets that neither Alexander nor Annalise imagined. She had grown up until the age of 10 at St. Clair's orphanage, run by Franciscan nuns in an industrial region of Chicago. Her childhood was marked not only by the absence of parents, but by recurring nightmares that made her wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Always the same nightmares: a tall man in a dark suit, holding a bloody knife, and female screams echoing in a dark room. Her father, John Murphy, had been found with his throat cut at home on a rainy April night when she was only 6 years old. Her mother, Helen Murphy, disappeared that same night and was never found. The police investigated for months, but the case was filed as robbery followed by kidnapping. Annalise was the only witness, but she was too small to understand what she had seen, and the nuns at the orphanage taught her not to talk about that terrible night. Since then, she had carried foggy memories of screams, fear, and the smell of damp rust mixed with expensive perfume. She never trusted authoritarian men, never managed to relate to anyone of the opposite sex without feeling a tightness in her chest that made her flee. But before Alexander, she felt not just fear, she felt a dangerous fascination, as if she recognized in him something familiar and frightening at the same time. On a silent afternoon in April, while cleaning the upper floor of the mansion, Annalise met Daniel Santos, the new security guard hired to work the night shifts. He was a 30-year-old former military police officer, with a gentle smile and eyes that conveyed security. When he saw her carrying a heavy bucket up the stairs, he immediately offered to help. Daniel treated her with care and respect, something she wasn't used to receiving. They talked for a few minutes in the kitchen, and he noticed how she trembled when mentioning Alexander, how her eyes filled with fear and fascination at the same time. He tried to discreetly warn her, suggesting that she be careful, that very rich men sometimes had strange behaviors with young and beautiful employees. Alexander, watching everything through security cameras, felt a rage he hadn't experienced in years. He saw Annalise's shy smile while talking with Daniel, saw how she relaxed in his presence, how her hands stopped trembling. That naturalness, that ease of relationship she showed with another man, left him consumed by a possessive and violent jealousy. That same night, Alexander ordered Daniel's dismissal, inventing an excuse about budget cuts. When Annalise learned the next day that the security guard had been dismissed, she cried hidden in the mansion's bathroom. She knew that somehow she had been the reason, and guilt corroded her from within. But she also felt a bitter warmth of satisfaction. For the first time in her life, she was desired as something unique and untouchable, someone for whom a powerful man was willing to act irrationally. This perception both frightened and excited her. She began to get ready more carefully for work, to choose the least worn t-shirt, to sometimes let her hair down instead of always tying it up in a bun. She didn't understand why she did this, couldn't admit even to herself that she wanted to attract even more attention from that mysterious man who controlled her life without ever having exchanged a word with her. Days later, while collecting clothes in the basement laundry, Annalise mistakenly entered a side door that she thought was just a cleaning supply closet. What she found made her stop breathing for a few seconds. It was a secret room, illuminated by soft lights and decorated like a private museum. There were photos of different women, dresses, perfumes, love letters, jewelry, and intimate objects organized in glass niches like precious works of art. Each niche had a golden plaque with a female name and dates: Isabella, 2019-2020, Camilla, 2020-2021, Layla, 2021-2022. There were at least 15 niches, 15 women who had passed through Alexander's life and become part of his macabre collection. But at the back of the room was an empty wall with an illuminated crystal support, empty, as if waiting for the next collection piece. Annalise understood with horror and fascination that he had already chosen her, that all that silent care, all those gestures of attention were not kindness or romantic interest, but the meticulous preparation of a collector for his next acquisition. She felt nausea and excitement at the same time, fear and desire mixed, in a way that left her confused and vulnerable. That's when Alexander entered the room silently, wearing only black dress pants and holding a glass of whiskey with ice. His bare chest was covered with a thin layer of dark hair, and his defined muscles revealed hours at the gym and body care. But it was his eyes that hypnotized her. Black, intense, full of a hunger that she recognized but couldn't name. He looked at her in silence for long seconds, savoring the fear and excitement he saw in her brown eyes. Annalise was cornered between the glass niches and the wall with no escape, trembling like a cornered animal. But she didn't try to run. Something inside her, something primitive and dangerous, wanted to stay, wanted to discover how far this man was willing to go for her. Alexander approached her slowly, like a predator savoring every second before the attack. The smell of his expensive perfume mixed with whiskey, and something more masculine and dangerous invaded Annalise's nostrils, making her feel dizzy. He stopped a few inches from her, so close that she could see the small scars on his chest, marks of a violent childhood he had never told anyone about. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a low, husky voice that made every hair on her body stand on end. But there was no disapproval in his voice, just a statement loaded with dark possibilities. "But now that you are, you need to understand some things about me, about what I want from you." Annalise tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Her throat was dry and her heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. Alexander extended his hand and touched her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity of his eyes. His fingers were warm and soft, fingers of a man who had never worked hard, who knew only the touch of expensive fabrics and perfumed skin. "I know everything about you, Annalise. I know you're a virgin. I know your mother is dying. I know you work 16 hours a day to support a family that doesn't even value you. I know you've never been truly loved, never been desired as you deserve to be." Each word was pronounced slowly, as if he were recording that moment in memory. "But I see you. I desire you more than I've desired anything in my entire life." Tears began to stream down Annalise's face, tears of fear and an emotion she couldn't name. It was terror and relief at the same time, the frightening sensation of finally being seen, of being important to someone, even if in a dangerous and sick way. Alexander continued caressing her face, collecting her tears with his thumb. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he lied softly because he knew that fear was part of what excited her, part of what excited them both. "I will never hurt you in a way you don't want to be hurt, but I need you to understand that if you stay with me, you will be mine completely. My body, my mind, my soul. There will be no one else in your life but me." Annalise closed her eyes, trying to process those words that sounded like a prison sentence and a declaration of love at the same time. When she opened them again, Alexander was even closer, his lips almost touching hers. The kiss, when it finally happened, was soft at first, almost respectful, but soon transformed into something desperate and possessive. He kissed her like a thirsty man who finally finds water, his hands exploring her body over her clothes with a reverence that made her feel precious and fragile. Annalise had never been kissed before, and the intensity of that first kiss left her weak in the knees. Alexander held her by the waist, pressing her against the wall, their bodies fitting perfectly despite the difference in height. When they separated, both were breathless. Alexander looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel naked, even fully clothed. "Now you understand," he said, his voice even huskier. "There's no going back. You're mine now, Annalise, and I'll take care of you like no man has ever taken care of a woman." In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between them changed completely. Alexander didn't touch her directly again, but began giving specific orders about how she should dress and behave in the house. He ordered her to clean his office wearing a short black dress that he had bought himself, an expensive and elegant piece that enhanced her thin legs and the discreet curve of her hips. Other times he asked her to serve tea in his office wearing only black lingerie under a transparent white apron, an image that left him excited for hours. Annalise obeyed each command with a mixture of shame and growing excitement. She felt exposed and vulnerable, but also powerful, seeing how her simple movements could affect such a controlled man. Alexander observed everything in silence, sitting in his Italian brown leather armchair, legs open, one hand holding whiskey, and the other squeezing the arm of the chair with enough force to leave the joints white. His eyes were as black as his intentions, following her every movement with a hunger that grew each day. Annalise discovered that she liked being watched by him. She began to move more sensually when cleaning, to bend more than necessary when picking up objects from the floor, to wet her lips with her tongue when she saw him looking. Each small command from him was obeyed, not just with fear, but with a sensation of heat pulsing between her legs, something she had never dared feel before, but which made her sleep wet with desire and confusion every night. It was a dangerous game they both played, a dance of seduction and power that was slowly consuming them, preparing them for an encounter they both knew was inevitable. The game of seduction and power continued for 2 more weeks, until a night of torrential rain changed everything. Annalise had stayed later at the mansion, cleaning Alexander's office after an important meeting he had with Japanese investors. It was almost 11 at night when she finished, and the storm outside was so intense that she couldn't see the street through the window. Alexander appeared at the office door, holding 2 glasses of red wine. He wore only a white shirt with the first buttons open and black dress pants, his bare feet revealing an intimacy she had never seen before. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability that contrasted with his usual posture of absolute control. "You can't leave in this rain," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "You'll stay here tonight." It wasn't an invitation, it was a soft order, but Annalise didn't protest. She knew this moment would eventually come, and a secret part of her had desired it more than she wanted to admit. They drank the wine in silence, sitting on the leather sofa in the office, the sound of the rain creating an intimate and dangerous atmosphere. Alexander told her about his childhood, about his mother's murder, about the cold years in New England boarding schools. He spoke about the loneliness that consumed him, about how he had learned to transform pain into power, love into possession. Annalise, in turn, opened up about her recurring nightmares, about the fragmented memories of her father's death, about the constant fear she carried of authoritarian men. But she also spoke about the strange feeling of security she felt beside him, despite all the danger he represented. "It's as if I knew you from somewhere," she said, her words slightly jumbled by the wine. Alexander stopped breathing for a moment. Something in that phrase awakened an old memory, a fragment of remembrance he had deeply buried. The way she spoke, the way she tilted her head when thoughtful, even the exact color of her brown eyes. Everything seemed too familiar to be coincidence. "What was your mother's name?" he asked with a strangely tense voice. "You said she disappeared. When you were a child, what was her name?" "Helen," Annalise answered without thinking. "Helen Murphy. Why do you ask?" But when she looked at Alexander, she saw that he had completely paled, as if he had seen a ghost. His hands trembled slightly, and there was an expression of horror and recognition in his eyes. The truth hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. Helen Murphy wasn't just the name of Annalise's mother. It was the maiden name of his own mother, Helen Murphy Lawson, the artist his father had murdered when he was 6 years old. But this meant that Annalise was his half-sister. His mother had had another relationship before marrying Charles Lawson, and from that relationship Annalise was born. The room began to spin around him. Everything made sense now. The familiarity he felt when looking at her, the way she made him feel simultaneously protected and threatened, the inexplicable connection that existed between them. They had lost the same mother, witnessed the same violence, carried the same trauma through different paths. My God, he murmured, rising abruptly from the sofa. You are my... But he couldn't finish the sentence. The revelation was too devastating, too forbidden, too dangerous. Everything he had felt for her, everything he had planned, everything he had desired, now seemed an aberration, a sin that would destroy them both. Annalise realized that something terrible had happened, but didn't understand what. She saw Alexander move away from her as if she were radioactive, saw the horror and rejection in his eyes. "What's wrong? What did I say wrong?" Her voice was desperate, loaded with a pain she couldn't explain. But Alexander couldn't tell the truth. He couldn't destroy her innocence with that monstrous revelation. Instead, he decided to push her away in the only way he knew, by being cruel. "Nothing," he said, with a coldness that cut Annalise's heart. "I just realized I was wasting time." "With you? You're not special, Annalise. You're just another employee." The words fell on her like sharp blades. Annalise felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. All the intimacy they had built, all the connection she had felt, everything disappeared in an instant. She stood up from the sofa with trembling legs, tears silently streaming down her face. "I understand," she said, with a dignity that surprised her. "Thank you for making that clear." She picked up her bag and headed for the door, but Alexander grabbed her arm at the last moment. His touch burned her skin, awakening the same desire as always, despite the pain. "Annalise," he began, but she freed herself from his touch with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "No," she said firmly. "You've said enough." And she ran out into the rain, leaving Alexander alone with the crushing weight of the truth he had discovered and could never reveal. Annalise didn't return to work for the next 3 days. Alexander cancelled all meetings and locked himself in his office, drinking whiskey and obsessively reliving the discovery he had made. He hired the same private investigator he had used before and requested a deeper investigation into Helen Murphy's family. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Helen had had a relationship with John Murphy before meeting Charles Lawson, and from that relationship, a daughter was born. But there was more. Helen had tried to maintain contact with her daughter even after the marriage, visiting her secretly until Charles discovered and prohibited any contact. The visit stopped when Annalise was 4 years old, but Helen continued sending money through a secret bank account. The money stopped coming when she was murdered. Alexander realized that his obsession with Annalise wasn't just sexual desire or need for control. It was an unconscious recognition, a blood connection that had attracted them to each other in an inexplicable way. They had lost the same mother, suffered the same loss, carried the same pain through different paths. But this made what he felt for her even more forbidden, even more destructive. When Annalise finally returned to work on Thursday, she was different. Her eyes had lost the shy sparkle that Alexander so adored, and she moved through the house like a ghost, executing her tasks with mechanical efficiency but without life. She wore even looser clothes, tied her hair more rigidly, and avoided any area of the house where she might encounter him. Alexander watched her through the cameras with a pain in his chest he had never experienced before. He saw how she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and stared into nothingness, tears silently streaming down her face. He saw how she had grown even thinner, how she ate little and slept less. He was destroying the only person who had managed to touch his soul, and it was killing him inside. One afternoon, he could no longer bear the distance and went down to the kitchen where she was working. Annalise was cleaning the oven, kneeling, on the floor when she heard his footsteps. She didn't turn around, didn't stop working, but he saw how her body stiffened with his presence. "Annalise," he said softly, but she continued pretending he didn't exist. "We need to talk," he insisted, approaching her, "about what happened the other night." She finally turned, and Alexander saw that her eyes were red from crying. But there was also a new hardness there, a protection she had built around her heart. "There's nothing to talk about," she said in a controlled voice. "You made your position very clear. I'm just an employee, and you're my boss. Let's keep things that way." But Alexander saw how her hands trembled, how she struggled to maintain composure before him. "You don't understand," he said, frustration growing in his voice. We can't. But how could he explain? How could he tell that they were siblings? That the desire they felt for each other was forbidden in a way that went beyond social conventions? "Can't what?" she asked, standing up and facing him. "Can't have a relationship with an employee? Can't be seen with someone of my social class?" "I already understood, Alexander. You don't need to humiliate me more." The hurt in her voice was palpable, and Alexander felt each word like a stab. That night, unable to bear the torture of distance and silence any longer, Alexander made a desperate decision. He waited until Annalise finished her work and followed her to the train station. When she boarded the crowded car that would take her back to West Side, he boarded too, keeping his distance but never losing sight of her. He followed her to her home, a small two-story house at the back of a larger property, where she lived with her mother and siblings. Through the window, he saw the reality of her life, her mother coughing blood on an improvised bed in the living room, her teenage siblings studying at an old wooden table, Annalise serving a simple dinner that was probably the only decent meal of the day. Alexander realized that his wealth was obscene in the face of that dignified poverty. He saw how Annalise cared for the family with silent dedication, how she was the pillar that supported that house. He understood that pushing her away from him wasn't just a punishment for both, but a death sentence for that family that depended on the salary she earned working in his house. The next day, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't tell the truth about their kinship, but he could find a way to stay close to her without crossing lines he couldn't cross. When Annalise arrived at work, she found an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a letter and a contract. "Annalise," the letter said, "I know I hurt you, and for that I apologize. But I can't let you go. I need you here, not just as an employee, but as someone important to me. The attached contract is a proposal. You will continue working here, but will live in the house as well. There will be a room prepared for you on the lower floor, and your family will receive a monthly allowance so you don't have to worry about them. In exchange, I want only your company. Nothing more will be required of you beyond what you are willing to give." Annalise read the letter 3 times before fully understanding what he was proposing. It was a tempting offer, but also dangerous. Living in the same house as Alexander meant being constantly exposed to the magnetism he exerted over her, constantly tempted by a desire she couldn't control. But it also meant security for her family, treatment for her mother, a future for her siblings. Annalise spent 2 entire days thinking about Alexander's proposal. She talked with her mother, who was getting weaker, coughing blood more frequently. She looked at her siblings, James, 16, and Marina, 14, both brilliant in studies, but with no prospect of a future due to lack of resources. The decision was obvious from a practical standpoint, but emotionally it was a minefield. When she finally accepted, Alexander prepared for her the most beautiful room on the ground floor, with a view of the garden and a private bathroom. New furniture, expensive, clothes, everything the best money could buy. But he kept his word. He didn't touch her, made no demands beyond her presence during meals and some evening conversations in the library. Daily life together was a sweet torture for both. Alexander discovered that Annalise was intelligent, had her own opinions about books and movies, asked insightful questions about his business. She discovered that he had a sense of humor, that he played the piano beautifully on nights of insomnia, that sometimes he stared into nothingness with a deep sadness she recognized in herself. But the sexual tension between them grew each day. Small moments of proximity became charged with electricity. When she served coffee and her fingers brushed his, when he passed behind her chair during dinner and she felt the heat of his body, when they met in the hallway during the early hours. Hands stood looking at each other in silence for long seconds. Alexander fought against his own demons. The desire for her hadn't diminished with the discovery of their kinship. On the contrary, it seemed to have intensified. He knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, but couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to touch her, what it would be like to make her completely his. At night, he drank alone in his office, looking at her photos on the security cameras, masturbating with a guilt that consumed him. Annalise, in turn, discovered that desire was stronger than any moral convention. She dreamed of Alexander every night, woke up wet and frustrated, touched herself thinking of him, and then cried from shame. She didn't understand why a man who had rejected her so cruelly still exerted so much power over her body and mind. The situation reached its limit on a June night, when a power outage left the entire mansion in the dark. Annalise was in the library when the lights went out, and Alexander appeared with candles to illuminate the environment. The golden light of the flames created dancing shadows on their faces, making the atmosphere even more intimate and dangerous. "Are you afraid of the dark?" he asked, noticing how she had shrunk when darkness enveloped them. "Since childhood," she admitted. "I've always associated darkness with bad things happening." Alexander approached her, sitting on the same sofa, but keeping a safe distance. "When my mother died," he said softly, "I had nightmares every night. I dreamed of blood, of screams, of the darkness that took over the house after she was gone." His voice was loaded with a vulnerability that Annalise rarely saw. "Sometimes I still have those nightmares." "Me too," she whispered. "I dream of a man in a dark suit with a bloody knife, with a woman screaming. Always the same nightmares since I was a child." Alexander felt his blood freeze in his veins. She was describing the same scene he had witnessed, the same night that had destroyed his childhood. "Annalise," he said with a strange voice, "you said your mother disappeared the same night your father died. But what if she hadn't disappeared? What if she had been—" He stopped, unable to continue. How could he tell that her mother had been murdered by the same man who had killed his own mother? "What if she had been what?" Annalise asked, her heart accelerating. "Alexander, what do you know about my mother?" But he couldn't tell. He couldn't destroy the hope she still carried that Helen might be alive somewhere. Instead of answering, Alexander moved closer to her, his hands trembling. "Slightly. Annalise, there are things about me, about our past, that you cannot know. But I need you to know that everything I feel for you is real, even if it's wrong, even if it's impossible." "Why is it impossible?" she asked, her own hands now trembling. "Why do you fight so hard against this? I see how you look at me. I feel the tension between us. Why can't you simply let me love you?" The word love fell between them like a bomb. Alexander closed his eyes, fighting against the desire to pull her into his arms and forget all complications, all prohibitions. "Because," he said in a husky voice, "if I let this happen, I will destroy you, and I can't live with that." But Annalise didn't accept that answer. She moved closer to him, her hands touching his face with a tenderness that made him tremble. "You won't destroy me," she whispered. "You'll save me just as I'll save you. We both carry the same pains, the same fears. Maybe together we can heal them." Alexander knew he should push her away, should tell the truth and end that impossible situation. But when she leaned in and kissed his lips softly, all his resistance crumbled. He returned the kiss with desperate passion, his hands exploring her body as if it were the last time he could touch her. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more necessary. Alexander pulled her onto his lap, feeling how she fit perfectly against him, how their bodies seemed to have been made for each other. Annalise moaned softly against his lips, her body responding instinctively to his caresses. But when his hand began to move up her thigh, she stopped. "Alexander," she said breathlessly, I don't know how—" He looked into her eyes, seeing desire mixed with fear and insecurity. "I know," he said gently, "and I'll teach you slowly if that's what you want." Annalise nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of desire and trust that made Alexander's heart dangerously accelerate. He carried her in his arms to her room, each step a conscious decision to cross a line that could never be undone. He knew he was condemning them both, but at that moment, with her in his arms, nothing else mattered. In her room, illuminated only by candles he had lit, Alexander laid her on the bed with almost religious reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he unbuttoned her blouse, revealing the clear and soft skin he had imagined so many times. She was even more beautiful than he had dreamed, small and delicate, but with an inner strength that showed in every movement. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time, his voice hoarse with contained desire. Once we do this, there's no going back. You will be mine forever, Annalise, completely mine. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just desire, but a vulnerability he rarely showed. I already am yours, she whispered, pulling him closer. Since the first day I stepped into this house, I knew I belonged to you in a way I couldn't explain. Her words were like fire in his veins, awakening a passion that had been contained for months. Alexander possessed her with a tenderness that surprised them both. Despite all his experience with other women, with Annalise it was different. Each touch, each kiss, each moan from her was precious, unique. He wanted to memorize every second, every reaction, every sigh of pleasure that escaped her lips. When they finally united, Annalise felt a brief pain that soon transformed into pleasure. Alexander guided her patiently, teaching her body to respond to his, showing her pleasures she had never imagined existed. She gave herself completely, without reservations, trusting him in a way that frightened and excited at the same time. But at the moment of climax, when both were lost in each other, Alexander shouted a name that made Annalise's blood freeze. Helen! He realized the mistake immediately, saw the horror in her eyes, but it was too late. The damage was done. Annalise moved away from him as if she had been burned, covering her naked body with the sheets. You shouted my mother's name, she said with a broken voice. Why did you shout my mother's name? Tears began to stream down her face, tears of pain, confusion, and a terrible suspicion that was beginning to form in her mind. Alexander knew there was no more avoiding the truth. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair in desperation. Annalise, he began, his voice loaded with deep pain, there's something I need to tell you, something that will change everything between us. What? She asked, but a part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. What do you know about my mother? Why did you shout her name when... She couldn't finish the sentence, the realization hitting her like a wave. Helen Murphy was my mother, too, Alexander said, each word coming out as if torn from his throat. She had you before marrying my father. We are siblings, Annalise. Half-siblings. The silence that followed was deafening, loaded with horror and understanding. Annalise felt as if the world had collapsed around her. Everything made sense now. The inexplicable connection she felt with him, the familiarity of his eyes, the way their bodies fit perfectly together. They had been born from the same woman, carried the same blood, and had just... No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. This can't be true. You're lying to push me away from you again. But even as she said this, she knew he was telling the truth. She could see in his eyes the same horror she felt. I wish it were a lie, Alexander said, extending his hand to touch her, but she moved away. I fought against this for months, tried to distance myself from you, but I couldn't. What I feel for you is stronger than any convention, any moral law. We are siblings, Annalise repeated, as if saying it aloud made the reality more concrete. We just... She couldn't even say the words. Nausea took over her, mixed with an emotional confusion that left her not knowing what to feel. And, our mother, she suddenly asked. You said she was murdered by your father when you were 6 years old, but she disappeared when I was 6 too. That means... Understanding hit them both at the same time, terrible and final. My father killed your mother on the same night he killed your father, Alexander said, the truth finally revealed in all its cruelty. Charles Lawson discovered about you, about the relationship Helen had before. He followed her to your house that night, killed your father, and then took Helen back home, where he killed her too. Annalise began to sob, the weight of so many revelations being too much to bear. They weren't just siblings, but also shared the same tragedy, the same loss, the same trauma. They had found each other through a connection that went beyond the physical, a bond of blood and pain that had attracted them inexorably. We can't be together, she said through tears. This is wrong, it's sick, it's... But Alexander interrupted her, pulling her into his arms despite her resistance. I know, he said, his own voice broken by emotion. I know it's wrong, but how can I let you go now? How can I live without... You knowing you're the only person in the world who completely understands me." He held her tightly, as if he could keep her there through sheer willpower. The days that followed were the most difficult in both their lives. Annalise locked herself in her room, refusing to see Alexander, to eat, to do anything besides cry and try to process the magnitude of what had happened. Alexander, in turn, sank into a deep depression, drinking compulsively and reliving every moment they had spent together, every touch, every kiss that now seemed tainted by the truth. But the love they felt for each other hadn't disappeared with the revelation. If anything, it seemed to have intensified, fueled by prohibition and impossibility. Alexander knocked on Annalise's door every night, begging her to let him in, to talk, to find a way to deal with that situation. "Annalise, please," he would say through the door. "We need to talk about this. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." But she wouldn't answer, just cried silently on the other side of the door, her heart torn between the love she felt and the horror of discovery. It was when an even more shocking revelation changed everything. Alexander had hired a new investigator to discover more details about Helen's death, something that might perhaps ease the guilt they both carried. What he discovered was a truth that would forever change the way they viewed their relationship. Under Yamaim, DNA tests Alexander had requested arrived on a grey July morning. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, expecting confirmation of what he already knew, that he and Annalise were half-siblings. But the result showed something completely different. They shared no DNA. They weren't siblings. Stunned, Alexander immediately called the investigator. "How is this possible? Wasn't Helen Murphy Annalise's mother?" The answer he received was even more surprising. Helen Murphy had adopted Annalise when she was 2 years old, after her biological parents died in a car accident. She had raised the girl as a daughter, but legally, biologically, there was no relation between them. Alexander ran to Annalise's room, knocking on the door with desperate urgency. "Annalise, open the door. I have something important to tell you." This time she opened it, her eyes red from crying, her face too thin from days without proper nourishment. "What do you want, Alexander?" she asked with a lifeless voice. "There's nothing more to be said. We did something terrible, something that can't be undone." But he held her shoulders firmly, his eyes shining with a hope she hadn't seen in days. "We aren't siblings," he said, each word loaded with emotion. "Annalise, we aren't siblings. Helen adopted you when you were 2 years. Hold, you're not my sister, you never were." He showed her the DNA test results, the adoption certificates the investigator had found. Annalise read the documents with trembling hands, unable to believe what she was seeing. The woman she had called mother all her life, the woman she had cried for, wasn't her biological mother. Helen had chosen her, had loved her as a daughter, but there were no blood ties between them. "This doesn't change the fact that Helen was your real mother," Alexander said softly, seeing the confusion in her eyes. "She loved you, raised you, protected you as far as she could. But this means that what we feel for each other isn't wrong, isn't forbidden." Annalise fell to her knees, relief and confusion mixing in an avalanche of emotions. She cried for hours in Alexander's arms, cried for the mother she had lost twice, for the childhood she now discovered had been built on secrets, for the love she had tried to deny, but now could accept without guilt. "I love you," she whispered, against his chest. "I love you so much I thought I would die when I discovered we were siblings, but now—" She looked into his eyes, seeing her own love reflected there. "Now we can be together for real." Alexander kissed her with renewed passion, with the freedom of someone who can finally love without reservations. "I will never let you go," he promised. "Now that I know I can love you completely, that I can make you my wife, my companion, I will never let you escape again." But there were still obstacles to overcome. The social class difference between them, society's opinion, Alexander's family, who would never accept a marriage to a former employee. Alexander didn't care about any of this, but Annalise knew the real world wouldn't be as understanding as their hearts. "Your family will never accept this," she said. still nestled in his arms. "I'm a poor woman without formal education, with nothing to offer but my love." But Alexander silenced her with a gentle kiss. "You offer everything I need," he said firmly. "My family lost the right to an opinion about my life the day my father murdered my mother. It's just the two of us now, Annalise, and that's all I want." In the weeks that followed, Alexander began preparing everything to formalize their union. He provided the best medical treatments for Annalise's adoptive mother, enrolled her siblings in the best private schools in Chicago, bought a comfortable house for the family. He wasn't doing this to buy Annalise's love, but because he genuinely wanted to care for the people she loved. Annalise's transformation was gradual but profound. Alexander hired the best private tutors to formally educate her, stylists to dress her appropriately for her new role, etiquette teachers to prepare her for the life they would have together. But what impressed him most was how she maintained her essence, her natural kindness, her capacity to love without reservations. 6 months later, Alexander and Annalise married in an intimate ceremony at the mansion itself, surrounded only by the people who really mattered. Annalise's adoptive mother, now recovered thanks to the medical treatments Alexander had provided, her siblings James and Marina, now studying at elite schools, and a few close friends that Alexander had carefully selected. The ceremony took place in the mansion's garden, decorated with white roses and golden lights that created a magical atmosphere. Annalise wore a simple but elegant dress, specially designed for her by a French designer. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and her eyes shone with a happiness that Alexander had never seen before. When they exchanged vows they had written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Alexander promised to love and protect her forever, promised to be the man she deserved, not the man he had been before meeting her. Annalise promised to heal him from the wounds of the past, promised to be his companion in all the battles still to come. "You saved my soul," Alexander said, holding her small hands in his. "Before you, I was just an empty, wealthy man. Now I'm a man who knows the true meaning of love." His words brought tears streaming down Annalise's face, tears of pure joy. "And you showed me I was worth more than I thought," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "You showed me I deserved to be loved, respected, valued. You not only saved me from poverty, you saved me from a life without true love." The honeymoon was a 3-week trip through Europe, visiting places Alexander had known in his lonely youth, but now seeing everything through Annalise's amazed eyes. In Paris, he took her to the Louvre and saw how she was moved by the works of art. In Rome, they walked hand in hand through the historic streets, discovering together the beauty of the world. In each city, Alexander fell even more in love with her, with the way she saw beauty in everything, how she transformed any place into something magical, just with her presence. When they returned to the United States, married life settled into a routine neither had imagined possible. Alexander discovered the simple pleasures of domestic life, waking up every morning beside the woman he loved, having breakfast together, reading the newspaper, sharing the small dramas and joys of everyday life. Annalise discovered the power she had over him, how she could calm him when business stressed him, how she could make him laugh with her naive observations about the world of the rich. She also gradually adapted to her new role as the wife of a magnate. She learned to receive guests with elegance, to participate in social events without feeling intimidated, to use her position to help causes she considered important. She created a foundation to help young people in vulnerable situations, especially orphans, a way to honor Helen's memory and give back to the world the luck she had had. But it was when Annalise discovered she was pregnant that Alexander finally understood the true meaning of happiness. Seeing her carrying his child, knowing they had created a life together, a life that would be raised with love instead of violence, was the complete redemption he had sought for so long. "Our child will never know the fear we knew," he said one night, with his hand on Annalise's still small belly. "We'll never grow up without love, without protection, without knowing he is desired and valued." She covered his hand with hers, smiling with a serenity that radiated peace. "And we'll never doubt that true love exists," she completed. Because he will grow up seeing how mommy and daddy love each other, how it's possible for two people to complement each other perfectly. Alexander kissed her softly, thinking about how fate had conspired to bring them to each other. 2 years after the wedding, Alexander was in his office when he received a call that would change everything. The police had finally arrested Charles, Lawson, who had escaped from prison years before and was living under a false identity abroad. The man who had murdered Helen and destroyed their childhoods would finally pay for his crimes. Alexander shared the news with Annalise that same night, and both felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Justice had been done. The circle had closed. They could finally move forward without the shadows of the past haunting them. "Now we're truly free," Annalise said, nestled in his arms in the bed they had shared for 2 years. "Free from the past, free from fear, free to just be ourselves." Alexander held her tighter, breathing in the perfume of her hair, feeling the baby move in the belly he caressed every night. "Free to love," he agreed. "Free to be happy, free to create our own story." And as the summer rain gently hit the mansion's windows, the two fell asleep embraced, knowing they had overcome all obstacles, that they had transformed a dangerous obsession into the purest and truest love they had ever known. Their children would grow up hearing the story of how Daddy and Mommy met, an edited and romantic version that spoke of destiny, of two wounded souls who found each other and healed each other. They would grow up knowing that true love exists, that it's possible to overcome any adversity when you have the right person by your side, that family isn't just blood, but choice, care, dedication. And Alexander and Annalise would grow old, together, always discovering new reasons to love each other, always grateful for the chance that had put them in each other's path, always certain that, of all the collections Alexander had made in his life, Annalise